God's mission to this world. And the last couple lessons we talked about mission to the unreached, people that don't really know the name of Jesus or don't know much about him. This was very definitely true of Esther and her ministry, but in a very unique way. And we kind of all know that story really well, so we're not going to read through all the verses, but we're going to take some discussion points that I think are really important in our ministry today and kind of unpack those. So let's go ahead and start with, let's see if I can get my glasses on here. Reading the introduction on page 96 of the Lesson Quarterly. Well, first of all, the memory text says, "I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth." One of the most inspiring accounts of cross-cultural ministry in the Bible can be found in the book of Esther. A great deal has been written over the millennia about this book, and to this day, many Jews celebrate the feast of Purim? Based on Esther 9:26-31. Esther and Mordecai, her cousin, were Jews living in the capital of the Persian Empire, Susa. For whatever reason, unlike the other Jews who had returned to Judah, they, along with others, remained in the land of their captivity. Then, through a series of providences, Esther became queen. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. It was in this role that Esther, even if somewhat reluctantly, was able to play a major part in biblical history. In its own unique way, this story shows how God's people, even in foreign environments, can witness for truth. Whatever your time allows, read or skim through the book of Esther, which I did. Even though I know the story, I learned some interesting things from it on timing and little details that maybe I hadn't really picked up on before. Pretty interesting. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to skip Sunday's lesson and come back to it. Actually, not skip it. We're going to pass over it for now, and then we're going to come back to it, because to me that's kind of the apex of the lesson is on Monday's lesson, and we're going to really spend more of our time there than any other part of the lesson. So what is the backdrop? Can someone just basically tell me the beginning of the book of Esther? Not the whole entire thing, but the very beginning. What is the backdrop? What is the background? What is the scene, so to speak? Yes, Susan.
The king has this big party and asked Vashti to come so he can show off she's so beautiful. And she said, "No, I'm not going." And so he said, "Well, then you're out of here and you look for another bride."
Right? Another bride. And just anywhere, right? No? Royal blood? Did it have to be? No.
Yeah, beautiful girls within the realm.
Yeah, I would wondered if they would kind of forced to come, rounded up like cattle, so to speak, or they were volunteers. It's not really important to the message of the story, but some interesting details there that I always wondered about. So on Monday's lesson, you basically just summarized that. And now Mordecai is her cousin, apparently, because her parents had died. Esther's parents had died. We don't know exactly why. There's a very kind of a new movie that's out on Esther, and it's really good. I can't remember who was the one who produced it, but not all the details are perfectly accurate, but it gives the best view of the Persian Empire that I've ever seen and what the political situation was like. And in that, the theory was, and I think a lot of historians support this, that basically, we'll find out later, Haman, who came to power, was actually a descendant of King Agag, who was king of the Amalekites when Saul was king, as you might remember, and they were all decimated and killed. Well, King Agag was spared to bring back to Samuel, and then Samuel killed him right there in front of Saul because Saul didn't do his duty. Well, somehow he still had a son that was out there somewhere, and according to this movie, it was the queen, I don't know if it's historical or whatever, that had escaped, and she was with child, and she had the baby after. It's a very interesting story, but anyway, there's a lot of going on here politically when you start kind of peeling back the layers. And I don't know that I would have wanted to be king or queen back in those times because there was so much intrigue and stuff going on. You don't know when your life is going to be, somehow endangered because all this stuff happening, and we think it's so easy to be king and queen, but I'm not so sure it was. Just feel free anytime to insert something, Susan.
Yeah, I thought
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Big deal. And even their sons, or it didn't matter, they just killed off relatives and
Mm-hmm.
became kings. So.
Oh yeah, they didn't hesitate at anything to get on
No,
top.
no.
So we read. Yes.
You mentioned a little bit ago about how whether those gals volunteered or not, but the man who wrote a part of that lesson, we saw him last night on It Is Written,
Okay.
and he said they were kidnapped.
It's possible. There's a lot of theories out there. I was reading all kinds of stuff in the last few weeks, and one of the theories is that Esther was actually an older woman, and she was the wife of Mordecai. And actually, that's from Jewish history. The historians have carried this down, but I think the biblical history and what Ellen White says are actually more accurate, probably. But there's a lot of theories out there. It's hard to know what all's what, but it's a lot of interesting things to unpack there. All right, who would read Esther 2, verse 10 and 20 for me? Esther 2, 10 and 20. Have a volunteer?
Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. In verse 20,
Mm-hmm.
now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him.
Okay, so she was told not to reveal her heritage, that she was a Jew. Now, what implications did that have? Is it just like not saying, well, actually my bloodline is German English. I just don't need to say that. I'm not going to say that when I get in a high position. Was it on that level, or was it much more than that? And why?
They were hiding because when she came to the town, he changed her name from Hadassah to Esther.
Mm-hmm.
Esther is actually come from Ishtar, the goddess of that place, and his name Mardeke, it also comes from Marduk, another god. So they were let go. They were hiding
Mm-hmm.
their identity. They were hiding their religion. They were trying to look like they are everybody else.
It makes you wonder when Esther did become queen, because we know that she was chosen by the king. And incidentally, this is not part of the main message of the lesson. What I find interesting is that we have a very childlike kind of summary of that from Bible story books and whatever we've listened to as kids, like Bible Story Hour and whatever. That, these maidens, a few of them walked down the aisle, and he said, well, no, not, okay, bring in the next one. And it was not like that. This is 4 years into her being taken to the harem that she was actually taken to the king. And guess what? Every maiden spent a whole night with the king. It says that clearly in the Bible, and they were taken to the house of concubines afterwards, meaning they were not virgins anymore. So the king spent a night with every single one to know if he really loved them or liked them. I don't know if it could be love, but anyway, he thought it was. So this is like heavy-duty stuff. This is not childish stuff. I mean, we're talking about he was really serious about finding the right person, and he went through all these hundreds of women to do that, apparently. And was she the right one? Somehow, God overruled even a king's heart. He could have chosen anybody, but he chose Esther. And even though she's hiding her identity, I really wonder, how did she live out her faith, or did she? For instance, things come up in my mind like, what about unclean meats? What about the Sabbath? When things came up on Sabbath, what did she do? All of these things, did she just kind of become like any Persian would be and not really keep her faith? Or did she actually live it out in some way that was non-offensive? I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
Well, there is a clue, I think, when in story her servants loved her so much because of her character. They saw something in her that was unique, and so it makes me wonder if she didn't somehow live it out. It's just something I think of.
I mean, there's a lot you can live out, even if it's not the culture of the land. I mean, obviously, basic Christian values or moral values, kindness, honesty, hospitality, all of these things, but there are some very specific things that we believe, that the Jews then believed. How would you live out those things in a heathen court?
The interesting fact is that she asked the Mardaki to pray and fast. She said, me and my servant. So she was given
Mm-hmm.
servants that were not Jews. And they were with her for all these years. So she converted them because when she prayed, they prayed with her. And then she fasted, they fasted with her. So
Mm-hmm.
it tells a lot about
Mhm.
That's a big, big thing.
Yeah, it speaks a lot for her character that, um, she was being kind of undercover agent, so to speak, because of Mordecai's injunction to her, and he was in like the place of father to her, and she honored that. And yet, when it came down to it, she was willing to give up her life. And being queen, that's a big deal. I'll go in and I'll be like a sacrifice my life for my whole people. Um, that's basically no greater love has a man than this, that he'll lay down his life for a friend or a woman. So she definitely was a very godly woman, whether she overtly showed every part of her faith or not. But I think we're going to come back to that because, like, how do we live out in our modern world incarnational ministry? That's something that's really close to my heart because of my background. So we're going to come back to it, but we'll just move on a little bit here with some other parts of the story. And on a Tuesday's lesson, I think this is even almost more fascinating, is Mordecai. How do you say it? I used to say Mordecai like Mel says when I was a kid. That's what my mom said. But then I've heard ever since then everybody says Mordecai, so I don't know which one it is. I'll just say Mordecai. That's what I usually hear people saying nowadays. So Mordecai, let's kind of unpack that. Someone else give me a summary of what Mordecai's doing at palace and what happened in relation to this man who has a power grab over the empire, this Haman guy, and takes control of everything. Explain to all of us Mordecai's involvement with all of this. Somebody? Anybody?
He evidently has a position. He's at the gate, and so that's and later he comes like prime minister. It appears, and so Haman is put up, and he's requested to, everyone has to bow to him and kneel, and Mordecai refuses to, and so that stirs Haman's heart to eradicate the Jews, all of them. And so evidently he knew he was a Jew.
Right.
And
So
he wouldn't bow to this person. He probably was honorable to the king, but not to this man.
okay, so yeah, and it says in verse 2 of chapter 3, verse 1 says, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so was the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. As some scholars believe that was simply because of the Amalekite versus Jewish thing, that they were supposed to have been killed, they were a prescribed race, and therefore he wasn't going to bow. But I don't think so, and when I read Ellen White's comments on this, she says he would not pay worshipful reverence to Haman. So that implies basically it was a kind of worship thing that had been required. And obviously, why wouldn't he do that?
This is the same scenario you see in Daniel with the three Hebrew worthies, and you see it all through the Bible. When we lovingly live our life and stand for the principles that God has us stand for, he moves us to the forefront. It may cause us to be persecuted or whatever, or we may be exalted. It doesn't matter. What matters is that if we stand, then God will use us for something. And that's just what we see. This thread runs all through Scripture. It's just not just here.
Right. So I have a question. All throughout biblical history, there were kings and there were godly people who would bow down to the king when they'd come in. That was just kind of normal standard procedure, but it apparently was not considered worship. I don't know what the difference was. Do you? Does anybody know? What's the answer to that question?
Yeah, so the bow down in Bible, people, it was just a common like handshake. So there wasn't like anything bad. But in pagan cultures, sometimes people presented themselves as gods.
Mm-hmm.
It was very common. So especially a king, if he did something great or win some victories or anything, people presented them as a god because nobody else can do. Sometimes they believed that, and they had the dreams, like, oh, his mother had the dreams and she was pregnant and the lights come to her womb and the snake crawled. Those very common stories. So sometimes
Mm-hmm.
So, and then it was a totally different way. Like in Roman Empire, for example, the first Christians, they were persecuted because they didn't want to worship Caesar as a god.
Right, but apparently there's a difference between bowing in homage or like, what should I say, giving allegiance to the king as king versus worship. And I don't know what that difference is because the Bible didn't actually say what that difference is. And I looked it up and I couldn't find much on it. But apparently they knew. They knew what the difference was because Mordecai was like, no, I can only bow before the King of Kings. Now, would he have bowed before Ahasuerus, the king? In a typical fashion? Probably, but we don't know exactly what that difference was. But apparently they did. That's, again, where it's so important to know the culture, because I've been in other cultures, and sometimes something that's really wrong in our culture is not wrong in another. And I'm not, don't say, Carla said, it doesn't matter what you do because it's all relative. No, I don't believe that. There are definite rights and wrongs. There's black and white. However, it's the intention more than anything that can be wrong or right. For instance, somebody can accidentally kill someone else. They had this in biblical times. They'd run to a city of refuge and get acquitted, and they would have to stay in the city the rest of their lives, but they didn't actually intend to murder, so they were not guilty of the sin of murder, although they had killed someone. Now, if you intend to kill somebody because of revenge or hatred, then that was murder, and they'd be turned over to their avenger, who would slay them most likely. So I'm not saying that the act itself is... There are acts that are right or wrong, but it's more the intention of the heart than it is anything. Am I trying to be deceptive or not? I mean, you can tell a truth, but say it in such a way that it becomes a lie, a deception, right? So I think we have to be careful that we look at the principle of what's going on here. And I just lost my train of thought. Where was I with this? So bowing to the king, was that what I was talking about? I'm sorry. Bowing to the king may have been an act of worship or it may have been an act of homage as a king, but it depended on what was expected at the time, what was known as what you're doing, and what's in your heart. So the same act of bowing could be worship or it could just be allegiance to somebody. That's what I guess what I'm trying to say. So you have to really know the culture that you're in. I've been in cultures where I had to do something that here would be considered wrong, but there it was very, very okay, and it was because it's still obeying the Ten Commandment principle. But here would have been like, huh, what? And over there would have been like, yeah, that's in harmony with the principle. It's hard to give an example just off the top of my head, but anyway, yes.
My thinking on this is if I was invited to the White House, I would show proper respect for the president. I would wear the proper clothing. I would do everything as respectfully as possible. But if you asked me to eat a barbecue that had pork in it, I'd have to say,
Yeah.
I'd rather have something else.
Mm-hmm.
And be polite about it. But to be able to honor the king, and as the Bible says, we're to honor the king and everything, where it doesn't conflict with our honoring God. So, and that may vary with customs because the custom then was to bow to the king. If I were to bow to the president, he'd think I was nuts.
Mm-hmm.
You gotta,
Well, exactly. Yeah. And
we see Christ trying to sort of split this hair also when he makes the point that you give to Caesar what is Caesar,
mm-hmm.
God what is God. So although it's not bowing, the act that you're giving, money as a tax is in essence acknowledging some, position that
Mm-hmm.
mankind
Right.
has created. And so it really comes not only just to the culture, but what's happening in the heart, probably of the person that's making this request, right?
Mm-hmm.
Carla, that you're expecting. What you're looking for me is a way to point to me and seeing Greg is worshiping me.
Mm-hmm.
That's why you're making this statement. And yet, also, where's my heart in doing this? It's a great question to consider because you see it in the story of Daniel, as we mentioned, as well as Esther. And you ask yourself, what was it like for Daniel to keep the Sabbath during this time? How could he do that? It's a question the discussion I have with folks that are in politics now is how do you do that?
Mm-hmm.
And yet, the thing that he did that they tried to catch him on was something that Bible describes. Daniel did this, and he would not change because he knew the thing being asked of him was to show that he would not stand for God when he was tested.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You're right. And I just thought of an example that I can, because sometimes when you just talk in theory, it's hard to understand the point somebody's trying to make. So when Emmanuel and I were in Cambodia as missionaries, we used to work with the local tribal in the northeast part of the country. And they had these gongs that they would, tap on when they played music and they had religious ceremonies. They started about this big and they'd go down a little, and then there was like 5 of them. We hung them on our wall once, like little down to the largest, and there was 5 or 6 of them. And there's nothing wrong with the gongs in and of themselves, right? They're just a piece of material. Now you can argue, well, how they're played. Okay. But let's just talk about the using of gongs, just in general, if you use them in a right way. Well, for the natives there, when they became Christians, they decided they didn't want to use their gongs. You know why? Not because the gongs were wrong, but in their mind, it was associated with demon worship. They worshiped the spirits with those gongs. And the first generation would say, don't want the gongs. It reminds us too much. It gets us in that mode. It makes us feel like we're worshiping the demons, the spirits, so we're not going to do that. 3 or 4 generations down, now we didn't get a chance to see that, but we've heard this from other missionaries. It was not associated with that. And when we brought them to our country, it was like, oh, these are really cool. There's nothing wrong with the material itself, and it did not remind me of worshiping spirits because I'd never done that before. So the gongs in themselves weren't wrong. The problem was the intention, what was going on with the gongs when you were using them. And not everything's that way, but there are some things like that. And that's where you have to differentiate principle, like what is the intention here versus what is the actual thing that's going on, form versus substance, basically. So anyway, that's just all things to think about, and I think we need to sometimes expand a little bit how we think about things. And I'm not in any way advocating like throwing away principle at all. I think you know me better than that. But let's just look at the deeper layers here, and what do you call, rightly divide the word of truth, right? I've seen people just stand back and go, that's wrong. How do you, yeah, okay, in your mind that's wrong, and it could be wrong, but you look at another culture, you may be condemning the wrong thing, because you don't know for sure until you know what's going on in that culture. And not everything's cultural, but, people get on the bus I was in Russia once for a whole summer, and they pushed and pushed to get on because there wasn't enough transportation. They pushed really hard. And sometimes I thought, man, they're so rude to each other. No, they had places to go and there weren't enough buses. That was a simple fact, so things like that. Anyway, I think we've spent enough time on that one, but yes, Esther.
I was just thinking about how Mordecai, I don't know how old he was in the story, but the story takes place about 50 years after Daniel dies. So Daniel, I'm sure, in the story that he had to tell, like the lions, I'm sure that's circulated quite a bit during Mordecai's lifetime. And it's probably, he had a role model, and he knew that he could stand
Mm-hmm.
for the right, just like Daniel did, and in the court,
Yeah.
just like Daniel,
Yeah.
and his 3 contemporary friends.
Right. Well, and the opposite side is also true. I think sometimes we come to church or we see people out there and we go, oh, they're such sweet, wonderful people. They must be going to heaven. Like we judge in that direction. And we go, how do you know that person is a sweet, wonderful person? It may look like that, but only God knows the heart. And I think we need to take a step back and say, God knows the reality of everything, and we can leave that with him, but also ourselves. What is the principle? Am I obeying the principle or just the form here? And go just a little bit deeper with that. Okay, so Mordecai was a faithful witness, and it says actually toward the bottom of page 99, from Daniel and his companions and Mordecai, a bright light shone amid the moral darkness of the kingly courts of Babylon. That's from Ellen White. I'm not sure why she said Babylon with Mordecai, because Mordecai was during the Medo-Persian Empire, but I think it was kind of a continuation of the Babylonian Empire, sort of like, they handed down the scepter, so to speak, that in that sense it's kind of used in a general sense. So for such a time as this, that's on Wednesday's lesson, let's just go ahead and read the Esther 4, 1 to 14. Who would read verse 1 to 7? Anybody read verse 1 to 7?
When Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on
Okay, and someone else read verse 8 to 14.
He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shashru, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and that he might command her to go into the king to make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. So Hathach returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people and the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law: put all to death except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. And Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?
Then Esther told them to return this answer to Mordecai. Go gather all the Jews who are present at Shushan and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, day and night. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Then Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. So actually, I've kind of forgot that there's that missing link, but y'all pretty much know the story of, because of Haman's hatred of Mordecai's not bowing to him, he basically found a way to go to the king and say, there's this little pesky people here, can we just kind of get rid of them? And I wonder, how did he get away with not saying they're the Jews, like this major people group actually? And so the king says, oh, go do with them what you want. He goes and says, on a certain day, a certain month, we're going to kill all of the Jews throughout the whole empire. And so that's why Mordecai is in deep distress and, all of this. So we just read that story. I wonder how Esther would have been discovered, and it's probably not even important, but she was not known as a Jew yet. If she had not stood for her people and done the right thing, Mordecai, he's like almost like a prophetic utterance, like, you will also die. You will be found out in some way, and you'll die. But God will raise up deliverance. I wonder, okay, so there's two major things here. Like, how would she have been found out? It's probably not even that important, but somehow she would have been. And then the other thing is, how would God have raised up deliverance? And why was he even sad and put on sackcloth and mourning and all of that if he knew God was going to, raise up deliverance from somewhere? I think there's a lot of interesting things going on here. Esther?
He knew that we have to depend on God completely, and he basically realized that there was no hope unless God intervenes. And he was turning it over to God, and that's what he was doing, because it was hopeless unless God intervened. And he knew that God would intervene because this was his people, and he had no doubt. But he also knew that it was only the Lord that can raise someone up. And he also believed, from what I can read here, that they have an opportunity through Esther. They have an opportunity to do something, but if they don't, then they have shirked their duty, and not only before their own people, but before God himself. And so he took that very seriously.
Right. Yeah, I think it's really important, even though if we know that God can and will work, if it's his will to do something, that we do our part. We all know that. But this is like one of the most amazing biblical examples of that. And in our modern culture, Christian culture today, you hear this a lot, like God is in control of everything. And I've heard this, that people actually don't do much themselves because, well, God's got it, Is that really even biblical? It says here, they did everything they could do. They prayed, they fasted. She did the unthinkable. And so God expected, he wasn't going to just drop, safety into their mouths like a little bird, like, mommy, give me some food. God says, do your part. Do everything you can do. And it was a dangerous mission they had to go on, right? This was no child's play stuff. You go to the wrong place at the wrong time, the king kills the queen. That's pretty serious.
And
You don't read about anywhere the ones who didn't do. You only read about the ones who did.
True. Somebody else raised their hand. Who was it? Somebody? Okay. So does God expect us to do everything we can do? Not in a, like, I'm trusting myself way, but I'm trusting you, God. I'm trusting totally that you will work in and through me, but I'm doing everything I can humanly do. I think even Ellen White has a comment like this. She's like, see, where was that now? I hadn't thought of this before. It just came to my mind right now. That we do all we can, and then God, he will step in and make up the difference. I mean, obviously we're human and we can't do everything, right?
I just think if things weren't that way, this entire story of Esther would disappear. And yet it's here for a reason.
Yeah.
It's here for us to be able to look back and say, this is what God can do. This is what is needed for us to be able to have salvation. I mean, that's a story that gets told through Scripture. If it was just, well, there's this problem, and I'm not going to ask Esther to show any faith in me, this story wouldn't be here for us to
Yeah.
gain that confidence in the rest of Scripture, the prophetic parts. We'd have no reason to have confidence in that if these things didn't exist.
Yeah. Well, and you hear, like at the end of time, Ellen White talks about this in the Bible too. We'll run to the hills, and you know that after the death decree and whatever, we could just sit there and go, God, if you want to save me, you'll protect me. Or like Jerusalem, the fall of Jerusalem, Jesus says, as soon as you see the army step back, go now. Everything was dependent. Their whole survival, everything, the survival of Christianity was dependent on that moment. They did exactly what God said. They didn't just wait for him to somehow put some kind of bubble around them. They actually left and ran for it. And I think we have to be careful again. It's not like just me. Okay, God, I don't know what you're going to do, but I'm just going to do what I feel like. No. Again, it's like with Abraham. He thought he did what was a good thing and took another wife. That was a terrible thing. He should have depended on God. God, what do you want me to do right now? And then I'll do that to the best of my ability. So it's a matter of like trust and obey, right? Total trust and total obedience. Anybody else have something on that? Yeah.
How are you doing for another? And I don't know, probably everybody here has experienced times when you open your mouth and you start talking in a serious situation and things start coming out that, I don't know where this is coming from, but I know it's good. And, that divine presence flows through you and you do things that you just never even thought of.
Mm-hmm.
And so you know it's not you.
Yeah.
But it's your putting your will with God, and he says, yeah, here we go. Amazing things can happen.
Mm-hmm. Esther?
I think sometimes we forget there is another power, and that's why we have to pray. It's not that God can't or won't, and that we have to beg and plead that he will do something. There's another power at work that's trying to keep him from doing that which he wants to do.
Mm-hmm.
He needs our prayers to basically grant him access, if you will, to this planet. And so, and I think about the second coming. Jesus could come whenever he wants to, and it's not it's not that he's delaying his coming because he doesn't want to come. He can't wait. He can't wait to put an end to all of this stuff. But he is waiting on us to pray and to ask the Holy Spirit, the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and to do our work. And what is our job? Is to the Great Commission. And so once we do those two things, so there is an aspect of where he works and an aspect of where we work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why the whole point of the story of the quarterly is to bring that out.
And being unceasing in prayer will give us the key to know what's my part right now and what's God's part. Because we could run ahead of God and do what we think, and it totally ends in disaster. Or we could just sit back and wait for God to do way too much of something we should be doing. So again, it's being constantly in tune with the Holy Spirit and in prayer. God, show me what I am to do and what I am supposed to leave alone for you to take care of. And Dad, I think you had, yeah, or someone else, right?
Isn't that the story of Job, where the devil makes this accusation of, look, you put this bubble, essentially. You put Job in bubble wrap. No harm could come to him. Of course he serves you. But, if you just gave me the chance, he doesn't really love you. He doesn't really serve you. He doesn't really believe in you.
And Esther was tested to the nth degree. I just try to put myself in her place and go, whoa. Susan?
Yes, as far as Mordecai saying God will raise up someone else, I said, well, we had Ellen White
Mm-hmm.
for that because God had asked a man or two before he asked Ellen, and they both declined. And so he went to this sickly, undereducated woman and raised her up
Mm-hmm.
to head the church, basically, and be a prophet to us and to the world. And so, I mean, we have examples here where he got somebody else to do it, and he can.
Yes, he can. But I'd like to be part of it, wouldn't you?
Amen.
I want to go back now, since we don't have much time left, back to Monday's lesson. I told you we'd come back to that. There's some things I want to unpack here as far as incarnational ministry. How many of you have heard that term before? Incarnational ministry. This is something I learned a lot about and read books on and got training in when we were, Manuel and I were going to go with Adventist Frontier Missions. They do a whole summer of training, and this is one of the things they talk about. And I think it can be taken too far, but there's definitely a valuable place for it. And that is basically, you know how Jesus, the Word became incarnate and dwelt, basically God became human flesh and dwelt among us. So the whole idea is that you become, as much as you can, like the host culture that you're going to minister to. You try to dress like them and eat like them as much as you can, and become kind of one of them, and without giving up your faith. And that's a really fine line to walk. How do you do that? Certain cultures, it's almost impossible, because everything they do and whatever seems to be almost anti-Christian. So it's challenging. It's really challenging. But at the same time, if you just go in there and go, "Hup, I'm an American, I'm telling you the way this is, and you need to sing our songs the way we sing them, hymns." We've done this before, even in the American West. Told the Indians they have to dress like us, they have to eat like us, they have to school like us, they have to have our songs, they have to have our worship forms like us. And I'm not saying they shouldn't become Christians, but we made them become us, and that was not effective because they hated us, right? How do you, go to that culture and say, we want to keep the good parts of your culture, because there's special things about every culture, and yet not just baptize the bad things? That's syncretism, they call it, where you take the forms and ceremonies and say, well, now a Christian name to it, and that's how we got Catholicism. But how do you transform the culture into an essentially Christian, totally Christian culture, but still retain the beautiful parts of their culture that have nothing to do with Christian or unchristian, and then to minister on that level? Wow. So we tried this, and there's a lot of challenges with it. Most missionaries go into one ditch or the other. They go there saying, we're Americans, you do like us, or they go there and say, I like everything about you, we're just going to become you. And neither one really work, because in the first case, nobody respects you because you don't respect them, and in the second case, you have nothing to offer. So, and this is what Esther had to do in that culture, was she had to somehow fit in as best as she could while still retaining her Jewishness, and not just Jewishness, but her godliness, what God had called her to do and live as a woman and as a queen. So you look at how she fasted 3 days to know, how do I do this? It wasn't that simple. How do I go to the king in a way that's not offensive and in harmony as much as I can with the Persian court and still obey God? And what she come up with was amazing. Basically, she still had to take a huge risk and go against the culture initially, but then when she got to the king and the king holds out the scepter, she's like, will you just come to this feast, this banquet that I've prepared? And that's very cultural. There's many cultures where you cannot talk about serious issues unless you sat down to eat and talk and get to know each other, and then you can talk, maybe, right? And then she did it not only the first time, she did it a second time. That's the way. Wine and dine the king, make his heart happy, make him attracted to her beautifulness, her femininity, or whatever. They bond together, and then she gives her request. This was very cultural back then. So, and again, but she didn't give up her faith to do that. So, but it's a fine line to walk. Anybody have any thoughts on that? This incarnational ministry versus living your faith in that culture? And it can be here, right here in America. We were Christian, and it was easier to live our faith. Now it's more and more not Christian and much harder to live our faith and still somehow identify with people around us. I find that always hard. Like, I don't watch the kind of movies people watch. Some of them are horrible stuff, and like they talk about it. I'm like, okay, I can't really identify. I can't really enter into it. And yet there are things I can. I can change the subject to something that we both have in common that's very cultural, that's both very American without denying my faith, and then somehow I have a way to bring in my faith at some point. I don't know. Anyway, yes.
I just had a thought as you were talking that Jesus did that when he came and lived in our culture, in that Jewish culture. He went to a festive Jewish wedding where there was dancing and feasting, and he made it work for him. He didn't violate his principles, and yet he was part of that meeting, gathering.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Make it work.
Yeah. Someone else had their hand over here. Was it Greg?
I wonder if it would be helpful if the first thing we were to do was to really sit down and be introspective about what we think a Christian culture is. Because what we would define as a Christian culture in the United States right now, which in and of itself is probably pretty varied, is probably far different than first century Christians
Oh,
and
yeah.
their culture.
Yeah.
And so what it points to is you have to look at principle. And I think we could all argue that even Christian culture in America now doesn't necessarily follow the principles that are laid out in Scripture to follow. So that puts us in a position of taking away some of that judgment and being able to look at another culture perhaps with a little more open mind when we ask God, show me what it is that you want these people to learn about in the context of their culture.
And how do I learn how to reach them?
Absolutely.
And that can be entering as much as I can into their subculture, whatever that is, without violating my principles. And I think we could almost say that America is sort of a pagan culture by and large. Maybe not right here in Montana, but you look at the by and large cities, university areas, big urban areas, it's kind of gotten pagan. And I think we could say this is cross-cultural ministry. If you're a true Christian in America today, you will be doing a lot of cross-cultural ministry. How do you do that? I think we just approach it too simply and go, oh yeah, I'm American, I can do that, I can tell them whatever I think and they'll accept it. I think it's gotten a lot more involved in that, and we need to be a lot more on our knees. Lord, how do I reach my neighbors? How do I reach my colleagues? Because it's not just as simple as it used to be to just say what you think, and people kind of can follow. Yeah. Cheryl?
We need to keep in mind, though, that the Holy Spirit is working with us,
That's true.
and He can impress their heart for these.
Yeah. But we also need to be sensitive to how they think and how they live their lives. Because we could say things that are so irrelevant. Either they wouldn't be interested or turned off or whatever. But you're right that the Holy Spirit can, when the person's ready, working in that spot, and we're working with Him, amazing things can happen that we don't have to figure out every little thing and how to. We talked about this with Paul in Athens, remember? And there's a balance there, though, between just preaching the gospel and living among people. Even Paul said, I'm a Jew with the Jew and a Gentile with the Gentiles. And, so there's a balance. Go, Susan.
Yes, the mission spotlight we saw in the church that in Ghana, that they were actually kind of clapping and dancing a little bit in the church, which you don't do that here. But there, I think that the dancing is such a part of their culture, and clapping, they've used it for maybe I don't know, just everything. It's just them. And so I don't think that it was made disrespectful or worshiping
Yeah.
demons and things like that. But it's just part of their culture.
Right, which brings up what we've talked about earlier, which is form versus substance. Is dancing in itself necessarily wrong? Depends on the type of dancing, the intention of the dancing. Go to a nightclub dance, it's probably all about human passion and glorifying self and immorality than it is Christ. Whereas these people in church, that's their rhythm. They go back and forth. Is that wrong? Yeah. It brings up a lot of things, but, Mm-hmm.
And these culture things we talk about, that's what those are. They're thou shalt nots
Mm-hmm.
that we think we need to impose on other cultures. And maybe they should learn that thou shalt not kill.
Mm-hmm.
Granted. But that's not how you get started,
Mm-hmm.
is beating up on the ingrained culture things. We're trying to introduce them to Christ. And when the Holy Spirit is able to soften their heart, then they'll be open to learning what they themselves read in Scripture.
Exactly. We have just a couple minutes left. I wanted, no minutes left, mention a few examples for you to ponder on through the week about true people who did good incarnational ministry and people who did not. I think of Paul and Joseph, Moses, Abraham. He was cross-cultural ministry. Think about people who did it wrong and why. What's the difference? Samson, Lot. Maybe you can think about somebody else.
Even Peter.
Peter. There's a lot to chew on there, and I was thinking through all these things, and it was a lot of good food for thought. So challenge you with that this week. See what a difference it can make in your life and your ministry with others. I think we could be a lot more effective if we knew how to truly do cross-cultural ministry, even within our own subcultures around us. All right, any one last minute thought real quick? All right, let's have prayer to end. Dear Lord, thank you so much for this wonderful Sabbath. Thank you for the great discussion we had here today, and I pray that you will stretch our minds, our hearts, open us to how you want us to minister to others, and show us, Lord, the balance between trying to meet somebody where they're at and understanding their culture and being as part of it as much as we can, but still being true to principle, true to the calling you've given us, and that we will not sacrifice our faith for anything. Lord, there's a balance, and it's walking a tightrope, but we're coming near the end of time, and it's becoming more and more apparent how different we are than the world, and we need this fine, godly discernment and understanding. Please teach us, we pray, and thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you for participating.